Hi, welcome to Topics in Art and History 3011, the long 1930s, basically 1930s, American culture in the 1930s through film class. And this is the first lecture for the class. And today this week, we're going to be watching the 1929 silent film, Why Be Good? But just a little bit of background today about the Roaring Twenties and about the decade before the period of time that we're really looking at. So in this class, we're really looking at sort of the 1930s Great Depression era, but we start with one movie that is happening right before the Great Depression kicks in. And then we actually end with a movie in the 1940s, right in World War II. So we're kind of bookending this class of 1930s films with one from 1929 and one from 1942. So this week we'll be watching the 1929 Flapper film, Why Be Good, starring Colleen Moore. I think the readings gave you a little bit of a background to this time period, but I just wanted to sort of emphasize some points. This is the Roaring Twenties that we're in. We're at the very end of it. Of course, people at the time that they're watching this movie don't know that it's soon going to come to an end. And in America, we associate the 20s with kind of this return to normalcy after World War I ends in 1918. It's seen as this period of economic prosperity in the United States, actually in the West as a whole, until the stock market crash in the fall of 1929. And there's a lot of important technological and cultural developments going on. There's the increasing availability of consumer goods, the mass production of items like automobiles, telephone, electricity is basically spreading to the general population. You have the early advent of radio. The movie industry in Hollywood is booming in the 1920s. You have the mass distribution and mass consumption of music through phonographs. And you also have sort of the consolidation of celebrity culture. Even in the silent era, you have this tremendous and widespread fascination with film stars and film celebrities and media focus on celebrities. And all of this is going on at the same time as the popularity of jazz music, right? Especially among younger people and young people going to jazz clubs, going to dance clubs, going out unchaperoned. Oh no, hanging out with people their own age without adults around to make sure they don't get into trouble. So there's a lot of generational differences that are taking place here too, in terms of the older, perceived as more traditional generations, and the young sort of jazz listening, partying. And of course, remember, this is during Prohibition, but there's a lot of alcohol consumption in America during Prohibition. So the 1920s, there's kind of this surface exuberance, but American culture has an edgy, frantic quality that suggests deeper insecurities. I mean, people even a decade later are still reacting to sort of the horrors of the First World War. Kind of this sense of party hard now because it could soon all be over. There's one famous sort of cultural analysis of the 20s that calls it dancing on the edge of a volcano. It's also, though, in a more positive sense, a time of changing ideas about women, about gender roles, and about sexuality. So there's this notion, I think your reading talks about a little bit, this notion of the new woman. And it's this figure, this set of ideas that starts to develop in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, so a few decades prior to this. But some women are pushing against their limiting the limiting roles, the sort of more Victorian limiting roles for women as wife and mother. And starting in the late 19th century, more and more women are remaining unmarried until later in their lives, becoming more educated, increasingly organizing for political rights, for women's suffrage, and working outside of the home. You increasingly too see women in public spaces, out and about in public, hanging out in spaces that maybe were normally seen as male spaces, and you're seeing increased mixing of the sexes in public space. And also women demanding more freedom and more political power. 1920 is when the amendment passes that gives women the right to vote in the United States in national elections. But women actually were organizing and demanding political power for decades before this. And women actually had the right to vote locally in many states in the West earlier in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century. Of course, not all women are included in this. in suffrage, as well as in sort of these changing cultural norms. Many Native American women aren't even considered citizens in 1920. That will happen a few years later, of course, because of Jim Crow laws and discrimination. A lot of African American women are excluded from voting, as well as other women of color. And we'll be talking, or I'm sorry, not in this class, but one thing, that there's been a lot of talk about lately is how African American women and other women of color were often excluded from the suffrage movement, and also from, some of these cultural ideas about who the new woman can be. This is something that's typically only or more easily accessible to women who are in middle and upper classes and have the ability to sort of redefine their lives. But one of the things that's not happening, though, in this time period, in sort of the late 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, until the 1920s, is a sexual revolution against Victorian sexual mores. So you have the rise of the idea of this new woman in the late 1800s, early 1900s, but there really isn't an associated shift in these more traditional Victorian sexual mores. That's really starting to happen in the 1920s. And the 1920s gives us the figure of the flapper, this sort of iconic figure, which is kind of one evolution of the new woman ideal. And flappers are really about part and parcel to this redefining modern womanhood that's been going on with voting rights. But we also think of kind of the aesthetics of it as well: shorter hair, short skirts. But this goes hand in hand with many of these other social changes your reading is talking about: women working outside of the home more, and in the 1920s, more sexual openness. So where does the term flapper come from? There's many theories, but I think the one that's most universally agreed upon is that it became a fad among young women to wear unbuckled rubber galoshes that flapped when they walk. Now that may be just a great story, but we'll go with that one. So one of the things that the movie will kind of touch on, Why Be Good, is this idea of younger women, younger single women entering the workforce, enjoying more freedom. They're earning wages, but they're in maybe clerical positions. In the movie, the main character is working at a department store, so their low wages still keep them living at home with their parents. But the money that they're making gives them enough economic freedom to make choices different from what their parents want them to do, to buy clothes, to go out in the evenings, to buy records for their phonograph, all of this kind of new consumption-oriented and entertainment-oriented behavior. And the flapper dress style in particular, which is probably what we think about when we think about the flapper, pushes very strongly against conventions of female dress from the late 1800s and early 1900s. So the flapper is free of a corset, so there's no kind of constraining garment, with shorter skirts, right, maybe even above the knees, rolled stockings and heels. Now, we probably consider them pretty low today, but, they are heels, and bobbed hair, right? Women cutting off their hair completely, their long hair, for a short hairstyle. And the flapper had to have kind of maximum freedom of movement in her clothing, in her hair, for dancing to jazz, right? And just sort of being out and about in a modern woman. So we are starting to see in the 1920s some loosening of sexual restrictions for women. The fact that an increasing number of women are actually engaging in sexual activity outside of the traditional bounds of marriage. And sort of, I want us to think about in the film how that fact that you actually, statistically speaking, have more people that are having sex outside of marriage, and more women especially, and how's this portrayed in the screen? Is this reflected in the particular story that we're looking at? Of course, one also has to remember, as we talked about before, whose lives are excluded from the image of the flapper that we have. I mean, I think, the famous dancer Josephine Baker is often associated with the 20s and the jazz age and the figure of the flapper, African-American performer, but she moved to France because of the discrimination that she faced as a Black performer in America. So, the cultural sort of image that we have of the flapper, I think in a lot of ways is a very white one. One of the things that we'll be thinking about throughout this class is how Hollywood reflects on and negotiates a lot of these social and cultural changes we'll be talking about. And the flapper was a big sort of stock character in Hollywood movies in the 1920s. And there's three actresses who were very well known and incredibly popular, huge celebrities for playing flappers during this time, who inhabited sort of this flapper persona on the screen and in sort of the way that their celebrity persona was constructed off the screen as well. So the first one that probably, if anybody in this class has heard of before, is Clara Bow. And we associate her with the image of the flapper most today, probably because a good number of her movies actually survived. Another famous flapper from the era is Louise Brooks, who originally actually was born in Kansas. I think she was born in Cherryvale and grew up in Wichita. There's actually a great book that was written, kind of a fictional book that was written about her a few years ago called The Chaperone. She was another famous flapper in the 1920s. And by the late 1920s, though, by about the time that this movie's getting made, this is not a Louise Brooks movie, this is Colleen Moore, but around the time the movie's getting made that we're watching today, Louise Brooks gets sick of Hollywood. And she actually, she doesn't think she's being taken seriously enough as an actress, so she goes to Europe and she makes art films in Europe, some actually amazing films. She comes back to the U.S. and tries to have a career in the talkies and the talking pictures that have started, that are really dominant now in the 1930s, but it really doesn't work. She kind of is down on her luck for a while, and then later actually is sort of rediscovered in the 50s and becomes a well-known film essayist. The Wichita State University Library actually houses her archives and her papers. It's really kind of interesting stuff to take a look at. But the third famous flapper is the one that stars in the movie that we'll be watching today, Colleen Moore, who was a huge Hollywood film star in the 1920s. And lived a long life, born in 1899 and died in 1988, and even more popular at the time than Louise Brooks or Clara Bow. Moore received up to 10,000 letters a week from adoring fans at the peak of her stardom in the mid-1920s. However, when the transition to sound comes right after this movie is made, right after Why Be Good, she only makes a few sound films in the early 1930s, which were not successful, and that's unfortunately, that's a common story for a lot of silent film stars, is they couldn't cut it, once pictures made the transition to sound. So she actually just completely retires from acting when she's in her mid 30s. She went on to she starts dabbling in the stock market and becomes sort of a stock market investing whiz and makes a ton of money investing in the stock market. And then in her later age becomes a prolific doll and dollhouse collector. The Museum of Science and Industry in Chicago actually still, since the 1950s, has exhibited the Colleen Moore dollhouse collection. Most of Colleen movies are now lost, which is again why she's not as well known like Louise Brooks, not as well known as Clara Bow is today. But that's actually not unusual. It's been estimated that about 80 to 90% of all silent films have been lost. Many copies at the time were not kept because they weren't seen as worth preserving. Another reason is fire. So a lot of old movies are typically printed on nitrate film, which is highly flammable. And there's a number of significant film vault fires. In 1924, the Universal Fire, the 1937 Fox Vault Fire destroyed a lot of silent movies, and the 1965 NGM Vault Fire also destroyed a lot of silent film, as well as talkies. So we really don't have a lot of these movies anymore. They're just simply gone. In 1944, Colleen Moore actually gave her personal collection of 15 nitrate films to the Museum of Modern Art in New York for preservation, including her most famous film, which made her a star, Flaming Youth, 1923. And that film is now considered lost. There's only a few clips left of it. But by the time the films had been rediscovered decades later, they had disintegrated. And that's another thing with nitrate film. If they're not stored properly, they just disintegrate. And so Colleen Moore spent the rest of her life searching largely in vain for prints of her work. It's kind of a sad story. So the movie we're watching today, Why Be Good, 1929, is directed by William A. Sider. Colleen Moore is the star, and sort of the male romantic lead is Neil Hamilton. If any of you have ever, I don't know why, but if you're a Batman aficionado, you may have seen the sort of campy 1960s Batman TV show. And Neil Hamilton is probably most recognizable to audiences by his portrayal of Commissioner Gordon in the 1960s Batman TV show. And you'll sort of recognize the strong jawline. It's very recognizable if you've seen the show. This film is produced by First National Pictures, which was sort of later absorbed under Warner Brothers. Why Be Good was actually considered a lost film for decades. It was rediscovered in 1994 at an Italian cinema. You know, this happens all the time. Somebody opens a box, there's some old movies in the attic, and oh, look, it's a film that's considered lost, but it actually took until 2012 to be restored. So it wasn't released on like DVD until 2012, and it's still really not available streaming anywhere. So when you're watching the film, try to think about what this film can tell us about 1920s American culture on the very eve of the Great Depression. Just sort of an interesting technical question. The film was made right in the middle of the transition from silent to sound film. So as the actors and as the crew are making this film, they know that sound is coming. I mean, there's already been a few sound films, and theaters are switching over to sound equipment. Therefore, this isn't a completely silent film. I mean, silent films weren't completely silent. Early silent film, there was live musical accompaniment. By the 1920s, you have sort of synchronized, maybe phonographs and that sort of thing. But this is you can kind of see the transition to sound coming. What do you notice about the use of music and sound in this film? And how is sound incorporated into the narrative? There's music and there's sound effects. There's no speaking voices. There's still intertitles. So think about how that's being used. In terms of larger cultural issues, think about how gender and sexuality are portrayed in the film, how different kinds of appropriate behaviors for men and women are being presented and maybe transgressed. And what this film tells us about changing norms of gender and sexuality in the 20s and maybe not so changing norms. And related to this is thinking about the figure of the flapper and how youth party culture in general is being presented. Is it a positive or negative representation or kind of a bit of both? And how do you think audiences in 1929 reacted to this figure of the flapper and youth party culture? What kind of pleasures were gained by audiences from consuming these images? Related specifically to the Ross reading that you were assigned, Ross actually makes this interesting argument that cinematic portrayals of the flapper were trying to balance spice, so sort of perceptions of sexy behavior, and acceptability, so sort of more kind of acceptable conservative social mores. And so think about how this film is trying to balance sort of sexiness, but also within kind of a framework of still sort of acceptable behavior, that it's transgressive, but also conservative. There's also a lot of generational differences portrayed in the film between Colleen Moore's character, Pert Peg, and her parents. What are the different representations of rebellious youth and old-fashioned parents in the film? And, do you see any similarities and differences to how these would be portrayed today? I think one important thing to note that her parents are being portrayed, it's sort of implied, it's not stated as clearly, but it's implied her parents are immigrants, right? That she's really kind of the first generation American. And so within that intergenerational conflict, there's also kind of a cultural conflict between immigrants and their Americanized children that we could talk about as well. Also think about how various economic classes are represented in the film. What are some of the class differences shown? There's kind of two clear families with very clear class differences, but also think about how these differences intersect with gender. For example, does the film represent working class women differently than upper class women? Also think about how consumption and capitalism are a big part of Roaring Twenties culture, of the figure of the flapper in this film. Think about who does what kind of work, who consumes what things and experiences, and what is money seen as valuable for, and how is this similar and or different to American society and American youth culture today? And finally, how do you think modern audiences, I mean, this includes yourself, you're watching this film 91 years after it's released. How do you think modern audiences would react to this film? How does this play into maybe preconceptions that we have in the present about the Roaring Twenties and the Jazz Age? And is there anything about this film's depictions of the 1920s that actually surprised you or pushed against some of these preconceptions we have of that era? That's all I have for now. And I will see you guys soon in our discussion class to talk about Why Be Good and the Flapper.